Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video I wanted to share my thoughts on the recent Final Fantasy VII Remake demo. It came out March 2nd, the day before Final Fantasy VII Remake was supposed to originally release, before it got delayed to April 10th. Now, I did upload a video of me playing through the roughly 1 hour demo that's available on the PlayStation Store, and while you can get a bunch of live reactions to different parts of it, I wanted to make a separate, more compartmentalized video where I could actually just state what my thoughts are on individual aspects, maybe provide some feedback on things that may be so-so in the remake and not just oogle over the things that were absolutely phenomenal in my opinion. Before that, I want to provide a quick history. Before that, I want to quickly provide you with a little story about my first experience with Final Fantasy VII. So, when I was young, I had only pretty much hand-me-down consoles and games. I had no turn-based RPGs because my older sibling didn't have them either. One day, I went over to my friend's house, and his brother was actually fighting Ruby Weapon in Final Fantasy VII, and that was my first ever exposure, not just to Final Fantasy or Final Fantasy VII, but to turn-based RPGs altogether. I hadn't played the Super Mario RPGs or anything up to that point. So I asked what the game is called. It's Final Fantasy VII, and while I didn't get it still for probably like 4 or 5 more months after that, my first thought when I saw it as this young kid was like, man, it'd be really cool if there was like a version of this game that had like free roaming and like action combat. Even as I think I was like 7 or 8 or something at the time, and I didn't know I was going to grow up loving turn-based RPGs like I did, but that thought has always resonated with me. Like, if they ever remade the game, what would it look like if they did that? And Final Fantasy VII Remake demo kind of just confirmed my thoughts as 7 or 8-year-old me that it would be awesome. And so that is my header for this video. The demo was awesome, but I want to explain what I liked about each individual part of it. So first point, I want to talk about stuff like the music, the sound design, the voice acting, only because I'm a little bit 50-50 in portions of this category. You know I'm going to fanboy over this thing the whole video. Like, let's just be honest about that. So I want to start with something that I at least have some sort of, feedback on, or at least some sort of not complete fanboy emotion over. Now let me be clear, the reorchestrated soundtrack sounds great. Sword slashing, guns firing, it all sounds really good. But man, at times, it almost feels like it's so busy that I would just like to slow it down. It's actually, going into the combat a little bit, I really like when I have the option to slow things down, because I can kind of take in individual elements a little bit better. Because they're so good, I want to be able to enjoy them. Now, that's, of course, the nature of an action game. Of course, it's going to be busy. Of course, it's going to be loud. But I guess we're having memories of the original Final Fantasy VII of, games that are turn-based or ATB. You have a lot more time to take in elements like that. So I think this is really only a concern I'm having because I'm used to that from the original Final Fantasy VII. When it's not actually a bad design decision or it's not poor sound design. It's just so stylistically different from what I'm used to, specifically with Final Fantasy VII, that it's a little jarring. That being said, the banter between the party members, I love it in all games, and I love it here as well. You get to see a lot of personality in the characters despite being so early. Barrett, still a potty mouth like he was in the original. Not quite as much, but I can almost see him talking in wingdings like he kind of does in the original. And Cloud actually has an interesting display. He kind of has a mix of his more damaged personality traits as well as his soldier combat prowess, and it comes through in big spurts. Like, you can almost feel like there's a big divide in the way that he feels and the way that he acts, and that's very appropriate to the character. Of course, the rest of the members of Avalanche all sound good. I especially like hearing Badger from Breaking Bad playing Wedge. Unfortunately, I don't know the voice actor's name. I don't know the actor's name, I guess I should say, but I really enjoy Wedge too, and his sort of more naive personality about Cloud. But it's almost heartwarming in a sense to see the way that Wedge talks to Cloud and the way that they interact. But all that banter, the voice work is great. That's stuff I could even judge from the trailers. I've loved all the voice work I've heard from the trailers, so I can only hope that I continue to like the characters as we hear more from them. Another small thing, item design. Now, this is something that's actually less apparent in the demo and more apparent in the various trailers that I've watched, but getting to actually see it in the demo itself makes me appreciate it a little bit more. Cloud and Barrett's weapon visual display is great. I love that the materia is actually visible. So a lot of these weapons have like random little holes in them, and design-wise, when I was young, it never even occurred to me that those might be for materia slots. And actually having these small little sections visibly on the item where you can see how they're attaching their materia to their equipment, that little detail is so appreciative because it's not something I would have ever thought of or expected. So the fact they went above and beyond on that regard is very, very welcome. And it invites back feelings from the original. When you got a different weapon, it looked different in battle, or it functioned different in battle. And through the trailers and through the demo, we really get to start appreciating that. And I hope that some of the other systems we've seen from the weapons add more visual displays, because we know that there's, ways to progress the weapons from the various trailers that we've seen before. And so it's nice to be able to see these and also have them go seamlessly between the cutscenes and the gameplay, because there's so many smooth transitions between the two. Now, next is level design. So let's be clear about something. The bombing run intro to Final Fantasy VII. Anyone who's played the original, that's your first memory of playing the game. That first introduction scene that we've got to see is wonderful. And this first mission is something that is super important to show people how much you care about this remake. It's the first impression that matters most. And its recreation and expansion speaks to the attention to detail of the developers. Every part of the original area, you can identify it as you're actually going through it. But it's not this very quick and small thing like it appears in the original game. It feels a lot more like a building, like a super important part of the functioning of Midgar, than it does in the original. It doesn't seem like broken down. It's very well guarded. It's nice to see that it's not just about recreating it one-to-one. They want to remind you how much scale they're adding to Midgar when it comes to the remake, and why they are kind of approaching the game as they are with the multiple parts. And you kind of get that idea right off the bat by just looking at the bombing run. The newer areas that are included that you may not recognize from the original also connect the building in more sensible ways. A lot of old RPGs, it doesn't really make sense how you get around. It's just like, why is this designed this way? Who did this? This feels like a real building that was put together with some sort of functionality in mind, and not just put together for the player to get from point A to B. And I appreciate that a lot. Alright, those are the really simple things that we can talk about. Obviously, the combat is one of the biggest divisive points to talk about when it comes to talking about 7 Remake. You have people who are hardcore, it's not like the original, thus it's bad. You've got people who are a little more open-minded, and you've got people being exposed to Final Fantasy VII for the first time, so they're just going to feel about it however, they naturally feel about it without really taking it as a comparison point. It's completely different from the original game. We all know that. But Final Fantasy VII Remake does its best to take the best parts of several other Final Fantasy titles and combine them in ways that feel not only new, but kind of faithful to the originals of each of those different features. It has more freeform attacking, it has more freeform dodging like Final Fantasy 15 in nature, but the actual weight of the characters makes it feel more grounded. It's certainly a lot less floaty, and you're not just zipping around everywhere all the time. Now, we've seen stuff in trailers that implies there are abilities that kind of look that way, but they're very set abilities that function in very specific ways. And so you're actually going to care about things like timing your dodges, or timing your blocks, or swapping between different attack modes, or how much ATB you're generating. I feel like all of those things really come together very well, despite the more freeform attack and dodge style combat. Now, the ATB system is, of course, the most direct reference to the original game. It's how the entire original game functioned on a turn-to-turn basis. But you play a much more active role in the ATB generation now, granting more gauge as you interact with enemies and use special attacks. And by special attacks, I mean you have multiple different... Every character sort of has a basic attack and then a special type of attack they can use. And landing the basic attacks or even using the special attacks often generates a lot of ATB gauge, especially with the first two characters that we play as. You need ATB to use any ability other than your most basic attacks, and I think this is the most important thing that they did. Most people look at 7 Remake and are going to compare it to 15, and if anyone has any issues with 15, it's how ridiculously unfettered you are. You just do whatever you want and you're a god and nothing can hurt you. In this, it doesn't feel that way because of a few different ways the ATB interacts with the more live action gameplay that you're getting throughout most of the time. It's required for all abilities, spells, and even items. But the big thing is ATB actions can be interrupted. So poor timing just costs you a pure ATB. If you go to use a potion, you're not going to get iframes to finish using that potion. If it gets interrupted, you're just not going to heal, and you're going to need to regenerate that ATB. The same goes with your various spells and special attacks, though of course different attacks have different interruption rates, or they might be harder to interrupt. But I'm sure that every different attack kind of has a different level of interruption, and kind of almost like a fighting game where you have super armor through some things. One of Barrett's skills gives him the ability to be interrupted less, for example. So things like that are actually going to be very important here, because you could just screw up and die just because you didn't time your ATB correctly. Now, one thing I was really surprised to see when we first saw it at the E3 trailer was the staggering system from Final Fantasy 13. So basically, by landing attacks in sequence, or attacks that enemies are weak against, you stagger the enemy gradually. You increase a stagger gauge at varying rates, and when the enemy is fully staggered, enemies go into a state of helplessness and take greatly increased damage. So you'd want to burn things like limit breaks or your ATB gauge when you're getting close to that gauge being full, or you want to save them for when the gauge is close to being full, and then unload them all as soon as the enemy is staggered. On top of that, hitting an enemy's weakness can pressure them and increase stagger generation. So they'll have like the word pressured under it, and attacks will start generating extra. And I really like that. I hadn't really thought of how elemental weaknesses were going to play into this whole combat system before. Like, I was just like, oh, they'll do more damage, so when they're staggered, I'll use it. But it's interesting to see them kind of knock enemies into the air, you know, put them into pressured states. So understanding how any spell interacts with an individual enemy, or even just a part of an enemy, is actually really important to the gameplay, because if you don't open up those points of weakness, it can take a pretty long time to kill some of the bigger enemies, especially the bosses. I mentioned limit breaks, by the way. That's just like it was in the original. They're almighty attacks that can do a variety of things. There's another gauge that generates this in combat, and you'll just have to learn what each individual limit break does and decide when they're best to use, whether it's best to use it super offensively or super defensively. It's going to depend on the character and what limit break it is. Among other things, you can swap characters in combat. Really glad to see that made it in for the initial release. You can slow down time to use abilities, or even fast access a few abilities or spells to maintain the speed of combat with a quick access bar. I actually didn't like the quick access bar. I really liked slowing down time to make my decisions. Again, it lets me kind of isolate the situation and kind of appreciate the individual elements, the menuing. It's very nostalgic almost to slow down the combat when you're using the ATB gauge, because it takes me back a little bit to the original, but in a more modern way, and I really do appreciate that little aspect. Now, I mentioned earlier there's attacking, blocking, and dodging, but these actually change quite a bit depending on what character you're playing or what weapon you're actually using. Now, for example, with Cloud, he has two modes. One of them is called Punisher mode, and in that mode you can't block with Cloud, but it does have a strong counterattack if you time your guard. A lot of people actually skip that little tutorial bit when it pops up because they're like, it's okay, Punisher just hits harder or whatever. No, that's actually really important, because there are some enemies that have very special types of defensive properties, so you either need to time attacks or you need to try to counter them in order to open up weaknesses. You run into an enemy later on in the demo that basically dodges attacks for several seconds straight, but you can counterattack their attack when it's coming in, and then you're completely open to just annihilate them because they're not very strong. We also see in, I guess, kind of the post-demo trailer, there's an enemy with a shield, and, you know, obviously if you just spam attack against the enemy with a shield, it's not really going to do a lot. But when he goes to attack, you can either time an attack, or you can use Punisher mode and counter that. And it's really good to have these multiple different kind of strategic uses for just the basic attacks, as I'm sure abilities are going to have interactions with all of these different types of enemies as well. But having the more basic attacks have sort of that skill aspect to them is very much appreciated. And I love anything with a perfect parry, so Punisher mode really resonates with me personally. Now, one thing I actually missed in my playthrough, but apparently Barrett can hit his charge button right at the end of his basic shooting combo to get what's like a perfect charge and generate overcharge without losing any animation time attacking. Little things like that are going to improve your output over the course of a fight and make it, you know, a little bit less clumsy. You know, you may not learn these things immediately, but as people, you know, spread the word about different tech or different ways that you can interact different attacks with enemies, we're going to see a lot more of this, and I'm glad to see these more strategic elements already coming out from just the bare bone basic demo. Now, unfortunately, because we only get to play as Cloud and Barret, the only other thing I could really talk about is the Guard Scorpion fight, which I loved. We saw the Guard Scorpion fight ages ago at E3. Of course, it was, you know, a made-for-stage kind of gameplay demo. I haven't gotten to play it until just now, and it was great. I haven't watched any of the extended demo footage to see any of the other bosses. I know there was like a longer demo that that press was able to play. I've avoided all of that at this point, so I don't know how it's going to interact with the other bosses, but if Guard Scorpion's on the scale that he is already, where there's a lot of different mechanics to it, there's very important aspects of gameplay that are introduced there. I feel like that whole first bombing run does a really good job of tutorializing everything, and the Guard Scorpion is the culmination of that, plus even a little bit more on top of it. Now for the last bit, story I can't really talk about much. I don't want to go too deep in the spoilers, because I know, I accept that, yes, the game's 20 years old. Like, I get it, it's over 20 years old. But there's plenty of people who will be playing it for the first time, and we already know they're making changes to the original story. The objective of making things a little bit clearer. So I'm not going to say too much about this. So if you know the original Final Fantasy VII story, we can usually identify different things about it that are either being changed up a little bit or being expanded upon. And it's fortunate for us that a lot of people who worked on the original Final Fantasy VII are also working on the remake. So I trust their directive and their decision making when it comes to elaborating on specific story beats. They said they were gonna, you know, fill in a few plot holes and make the story a little bit more coherent. And we see a lot of that in the trailer. Things from the original that don't make sense right away, but it makes sense to us now. And we're seeing how they're trying to expand those elements. I don't want to go any bit more in depth than that, but I could see all the little things they were building towards, and I appreciated it. Damn, I was actually going to do spoilers for this part, but last second I'm recording this, I'm deciding not to. I'm reading spoilers that I have written down in my story section of my notes, and I guess I'm just going to avoid doing it. Just trust me that when it comes down to it, there will be a lot of comparison videos to the original Final Fantasy VII. I'll probably make a few, and these story beats I'll just save for another day to talk about the more spoilerific elements. But I'm really excited to see where they take it, what elements from the original Final Fantasy VII make it, and how they expand that into multiple AAA releases when it comes to, you know, the full release of Final Fantasy VII Remake. And that's going to be a wrap for my thoughts on Final Fantasy VII Remake demo. It's going to be hard to survive till April 10th. We've got some other things to hold us over, but man, it's one of those times where I just kind of want to play it for an hour every day. And I also don't, but come on. Anyway, I gotta stop talking about it. What did you think about Final Fantasy VII Remake demo? Please let me know in the comment section of the video below. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned. Some of these things that I cut from this video will probably make their way into another video as well. So thank you for watching. I will see you all in the next one, and until then, take care.